Was it ever possible for us? Was there ever a time, ever a moment?
No.
There is a quiet tragedy at the heart of Game of Thrones that often goes unnoticed because it does not explode, does not scream, and does not kill anyone immediately. It unfolds in a bedchamber, late at night, between two people who technically rule the world. No swords are drawn, no plots are revealed, and yet this conversation is more lethal to the Baratheon dynasty than any blade that will later be raised against it.
It's a neat little trick you do. You move your lips and your father's voice comes out.
Because this is the one moment where Robert Baratheon and Cersei Lannister stop performing their roles and speak briefly as human beings, and in doing so, they confirm that their world is already dead. This scene works because it reframes everything we think we know about their marriage. Until this point, Robert and Cersei exist as caricatures, the drunken brute king and the venomous queen. Their hatred seems obvious, their cruelty mutual, their failure inevitable. But in this single exchange, the story does something far more unsettling. It refuses to assign a simple villain. Instead, it reveals a marriage that was not evil but structurally doomed, forged at the intersection of love, duty, trauma, and political necessity. Two people who were never allowed to choose each other, trapped in a system that demanded symbols instead of souls. What makes the scene devastating is not what is said, but what it implies. That both Robert and Cersei are right, that both are wounded, and that neither could ever have won. At its core, this conversation is about love versus obligation, not as an abstract theme, but as a lived experience. Robert's great love was a ghost long before he ever wore the crown. Lyanna Stark is not merely a woman he lost, she is the last version of himself he recognizes as real.
Someone took her away from me. And 7 kingdoms couldn't fill the hole she left behind.
When Robert speaks of her, he is speaking of youth, possibility, and a world where his strength had meaning beyond violence. He won the rebellion, won the throne, won the realm, and in doing so, lost the only thing that ever gave those victories purpose. The crown did not elevate him, it froze him in time, locking him into a role he neither understood nor desired. Cersei, on the other hand, never had the luxury of illusion. Where Robert mourns a lost love, Cersei mourns a life she was never allowed to have. From the moment she was born, her value was transactional. She was currency, a womb for alliances, a mirror for male power. Her marriage to Robert was not a romantic tragedy, it was a political inevitability. She did not lose a dream, she was denied one entirely. And this difference matters because it shapes how each of them understands failure.
What harm could Lyanna Stark's ghost do to either of us that we haven't done to each other 100 times over?
Robert believes the marriage failed because he loved another woman. Cersei understands that the marriage failed because love was never part of the equation. This is why the scene feels so raw. For the first time, Robert stops boasting, stops drinking, stops posturing as the warrior king. He admits regret, he admits confusion, he even admits, in his own limited way, guilt. He wonders aloud whether things could have been different, whether kindness, effort, or time might have changed the outcome. It is a rare moment of self-awareness from a man who has spent his reign avoiding introspection at all costs. But Cersei does not grant him absolution, and this is where the scene becomes truly uncomfortable. She does not rage, she does not mock, she speaks with the clarity of someone who has already done the math and knows the answer. From her perspective, Robert's question is meaningless. What he calls neglect, she calls inevitability. What he frames as personal failure, she understands as systemic collapse. They were never partners, they were never equals. They were symbols forced into proximity and told to pretend that proximity would become intimacy. This is the first time we see Cersei not as a future tyrant, but as a lucid observer of her own tragedy. She recognizes that Robert never truly saw her, not because he was cruel, but because the world had already assigned her a role that erased her interior life. He loved a woman who represented freedom. He married a woman who represented duty, and he punished her unconsciously for not being Lyanna. That wound never healed, and Cersei understands that it never could have. What makes the scene extraordinary is that it allows Robert a measure of dignity without redeeming him. Yes, he is trapped in a crown he never wanted. Yes, the throne hollowed him out, but the conversation also makes clear that his suffering does not excuse his failures. He chose violence as escape. He chose alcohol as anesthesia. He chose to rule by avoidance, delegating responsibility to men like Jon Arryn and later Ned Stark because governing required emotional labor he could not perform. Robert did not merely lose himself, he abandoned himself, and in doing so, he abandoned his marriage, his children, and his kingdom. Cersei, for her part, is not absolved either. Her bitterness, her cruelty, her eventual willingness to burn the realm rather than submit to it, all of these seeds are visible here. But the scene reframes them not as inherent malice, but as defensive evolution.
We haven't had a real fight in 9 years. Backstabbing doesn't prepare you for a fight, and that's all the realm is now. Sometimes I don't know what holds it together.
She learned early that vulnerability was punished, that affection was leverage, and that power was the only language that could protect her from erasure. Where Robert retreated into nostalgia, Cersei hardened into ambition. Both responses are understandable, both are destructive. The brilliance of this moment lies in its symmetry. Two people sit in the same room, reflecting on the same marriage, and arrive at different truths that coexist without contradiction. Robert is right that love mattered. Cersei is right that it never stood a chance. Robert is right that he failed as a husband. Cersei is right that the institution itself was a lie. Neither is wrong, and yet both lose everything. This is why the scene predicts the fall of the Baratheon regime so precisely. The marriage is not merely a personal failure, it is a microcosm of the political order Robert presides over. A kingdom held together by memory rather than vision, by the myth of a glorious rebellion rather than the reality of governance. Robert rules the realm the same way he approached his marriage, assuming that victory would be enough, that time would smooth over structural flaws, that someone else would handle the consequences. Cersei, crucially, sees this coming, long before dragons return, long before the War of the Five Kings, long before the crown begins to bleed gold and bodies. In this quiet conversation, she articulates, without ever stating it outright, that the realm is already hollow, that the king is absent, that the symbol has decayed, and that when the illusion finally collapses, it will not collapse gently. This is why the scene feels like the last calm breath of the realm. After this night, everything accelerates. Ned Stark moves closer to the truth. Robert rides out on a hunt that will kill him. The balance Jon Arryn once maintained is gone, and the marriage, the symbolic center of the ruling order, is revealed to be irreparable. There will be no reconciliation, no reform, no second chance, only succession, bloodshed, and war. But perhaps the most haunting element of the scene is how human it is. There is no winner here, no clever manipulation, no hidden dagger, just two exhausted people confronting the ruins of a life neither of them chose. Robert's voice carries the weight of a man who conquered the world too early and had nothing left to fight for. Cersei's carries the steel of a woman who learned that survival required foresight and ruthlessness in a world that offered her neither mercy nor autonomy. Their tragedy is not that they hated each other, it is that they understood each other too late. And this understanding comes with a devastating implication, that the Baratheon dynasty did not fall because of prophecy or incest or political intrigue alone, but because it was built on emotional dishonesty, a crown forged from war but sustained by denial, a marriage meant to unite houses but incapable of uniting hearts, a king who mistook conquest for purpose, and a queen who mistook control for safety. In that bedchamber, the truth finally surfaces, and it is quieter than expected. No shouting, no tears, just resignation, the recognition that the damage is not reversible, that love cannot be retrofitted into a structure designed without it, that duty without meaning becomes suffocation, and that power, when stripped of self-knowledge, corrodes everything it touches. Robert will die believing the past was better. Cersei will survive by believing the future must be seized, and the realm will fracture because neither belief can sustain a kingdom. This is why the scene endures, because it tells us something profoundly uncomfortable, that sometimes history is not shaped by villains and heroes, but by people who were honest and still doomed. That two people can speak the truth, see the problem clearly, and yet remain incapable of fixing it. And that the most dangerous moment in any empire is not the riot, not the assassination, not the war, but the night when its rulers finally admit to each other that it was never going to work. After this conversation, the masks return, but the damage is done. The silence that follows is heavier than any argument, and as the king and queen turn away from each other, the realm follows, drifting unknowingly toward collapse, because this was the moment the Baratheon reign exhaled for the last time. And that final exhalation matters because what follows is not chaos erupting out of nowhere, but entropy finally being allowed to do its work. After this night, Robert does not become crueler or wiser. He simply becomes more absent. The honesty drains what little illusion he had left. Once a man admits to himself that his life is irreparably broken, effort begins to feel pointless. His hunt is not merely a pastime, it is an abdication in motion. A king riding away from responsibility, from intimacy, from consequence. He is already half dead in this conversation, long before the boar finishes the job. Cersei, meanwhile, absorbs the truth and recalibrates. This is an underrated moment in her arc, because it reveals that her later ruthlessness is not born from madness, but from clarity. She understands that Robert's death, whether by time, wine, or fate, is inevitable. She understands that the system will not protect her children. She understands that the realm does not reward honesty or vulnerability, only preparedness. This is not the speech of a woman plotting tyranny. It is the recognition of a woman who knows that when the scaffolding collapses, only those who planned for collapse survive. And this is where the tragedy deepens. Because in another world, one where marriage was not a political weapon, where kings were allowed to grieve properly, where women were not reduced to vessels, this conversation might have been a beginning, an inflection point, a chance at rebuilding something smaller, quieter, more honest. But Game of Thrones is not interested in that fantasy. It is interested in systems, and systems do not pivot on emotional breakthroughs. They grind forward until they break. The Baratheon regime breaks because its core relationship cannot generate meaning. Robert embodies victory without direction. Cersei embodies intelligence without legitimacy. Together, they rule a realm that mistakes inertia for stability. Everyone around them senses it. Jon Arryn dies trying to shore it up. Ned Stark walks into it blindly. Littlefinger and Varys exploit it methodically. But Robert and Cersei are the first to say it out loud, that the center cannot hold. That is why this scene lingers long after flashier moments fade. It does not shock, it clarifies. It shows us that the war to come is not the result of sudden betrayal, but of long-standing emotional neglect metastasizing into political disaster. That the crown was already empty before it ever changed hands, and that the most honest conversation in the early seasons is also the most fatal, because once the truth is spoken, it cannot be unspoken, and once a king and queen understand that their union was a mistake, the realm built upon it has already begun to fall.